From an outside view, libertarianism seems like we're all about free markets and limiting the powers of the government. And that's true, but libertarianism is much more than that. There are many problems libertarianism faces that at first seems unclear what the solution is. As a libertarian myself, and as a student pilot, one of my questions for libertarianism was how would an airspace work in a libertarian society, and can airspaces be property? In order to answer this question, we need to briefly go over the libertarian ethic, otherwise known as the non-aggression principle. For clarification, this video will not be a video justifying libertarianism. If you are interested in that, there will be a link in the description for that topic. At the root of the theory is the axiom of human action, or otherwise known simply as action. Action is the employment of scarce resources as a means to attempt to satisfy or further satisfy a deliberate end. For example, let's say Charles uses a spear to hunt. The spear is a scarce resource, and Charles is using it. That use is also called the means. What are the means for? To hunt. Hunting is Charles' end, aka it is the reason why Charles uses the spear. Conflict is when two human actions cannot happen at the same time. For example, Charles cannot use the spear, and also Polly cannot use the same spear towards a different end at the same time. Libertarianism is a theory of who should have the resource in a given conflict. In this conflict I described, who should have the spear, Charles or Polly? If we assume Charles had the spear first, libertarianism theorizes that Charles should have the ownership of the spear. Ownership is the justified control or direction of a scarce resource. In other words, Charles has a right to the spear. A right is a justified action within a given conflict. How would we know Charles had the spear first? We would know if Polly started or initiated the conflict. For example, before Polly wanted to use the spear, Charles was using the spear first. There was no conflict before, but when Polly tries to use the spear at the same time Charles was already using it, Polly is initiating a conflict. We would call Polly the aggressor, and we would call Polly's action an aggression. Hence why the libertarian ethic is also called the non-aggression principle. All of this I have explained is necessary to understand what is legitimate property. Property is an identified resource that is owned by someone. Now that we know a proper theory of how resources should be used, we can apply this to answering the question, can an airspace be legitimate property? If not, how would airspaces work in a society that obeys the theory of libertarianism? Of course, in order to know this, we need to know what is an airspace. An airspace is a three-dimensional territorial portion of the atmosphere defining the rules and regulations for aircrafts to operate in. Everywhere you are, at least as far as I know for the US, you are in some kind of airspace. According to the Federal Aviation Administration's National Airspace System Overview, the purpose of controlled airspace is intended to ensure the separation of IFR traffic from other aircrafts, both IFR and VFR. And VFR and IFR are two different sets of rules for piloting an aircraft. Of course, for the purpose of our question, we are assuming a society without the FAA or any state control upon society. Any airspaces in our hypothetical society would have to be private property if it were to be legitimate property. In order for something to be property, it needs to be a scarce resource, or a resource that has the potential for conflict to occur over it. Just like how we can imagine if Polly were to trespass onto Charles' front lawn, or any other form of territory, it could lead to conflict. Thus, we could imagine that if Polly were to fly into Charles' airspace he claims to own, there could be a conflict. It cannot be the case that Charles is the only one in his airspace and Polly is also in Charles' airspace at the same time. So we can say an airspace is like a plot of land, but instead it's in the sky. It is a scarce resource. There is a problem for the case of ownership over an airspace. Libertarianism theorizes the purpose for any property norm is to avoid conflict. Because of that, the borders of any airspace needs to have objective borders in order to avoid conflicts. If it did not, it would not be universally known where the bounds of the private property are. Airspaces realistically cannot have objective or intersubjective ascertainable borders. So airspaces cannot be private property. Then can there be a way for airspaces to serve a useful function in a libertarian society if they cannot be private property? Yes, actually, and here's why. Let's go back to Charles and Polly. If Charles no longer employs any action with his spear, he has abandoned the spear. This means there would be no potential for conflict if Polly were to use the spear for her own ends, and she would be the new property owner. Now let's say Charles owns the spear, and both Charles and Polly agree to a transfer of the title of ownership over the spear from Charles to Polly. What would this mean? Charles is effectively abandoning the spear at the same time Polly is acquiring it. This is called a contract. Now that we understand a proper theory of contracts, we can apply this to the purpose of an airspace. Imagine an airport that offers a contract with pilots who would like to use the airport for takeoffs and landings. As the owner of the airport has the right to exclude anyone, he or she may only permit pilots to enter the airport if they sign a contract to obey the rules within an imaginary bordered airspace. The contract would include a fee of some kind if the rules are to be broken. This contract is valid since the pilot would be agreeing to a title transfer of property if the conditions were met. In this case, the pilot would be agreeing to pay a fee if the conditions were met that he or she broke the rules inside the airspace. This does not hold the pilot liable to any crime of breaking the airspace rules themselves, but rather the pilot would be held liable to dodging fees if he or she did not pay the fees. Naturally, the fees would be an incentive to obey the rules of the airspace. The consequences of breaking airspace rules would effectively be the same in any case, since preventing the rules from being broken with force is realistically impossible in a flying aircraft. But what if a pilot takes off from airport A, let's say, and flies over airport B's airspace? A pilot would have no liability for repercussion if the pilot were to break the rules in airspace B. We could further extend the contract to include an obligation to respect airspace B, or else the pilot would be fined. And the same kind of contract can also be imposed by airport B. This is mutually beneficial to both airports because both of them would receive a greater chance of order within their airspaces by working together. We could imagine this system to include other airports too, forming into a complex, coherent web of contracts establishing a universal or standard order for airspaces. Thank you for watching. You reached the end of the video. I appreciate it because, well, um, this is unscripted. Fuck.